I love the drama of a sting operation, don't you? There's some party that's perceived to be guilty, but investigators need proof. They need proof of guilt. They need proof of malicious intent before they can apprehend and prosecute the person. Just last month in August, I believe it was August 17th, there was an article in the Mercury News that reported a massive joint sting operation here in the Bay Area that took down more than 100 people. Massive, I believe it was 102 people being taken down in connection with a criminal ring of car thieves. The passage before us really amounts to an attempted sting operation by Jesus' opponents. They want to trap him in word, the text says. Like an investigator wearing a wire, trying to catch a suspect making incriminating statements. They are eager. They're desperate to take down Jesus, whatever it takes. When we concluded the passage immediately preceding just last week, an entourage of scribes, chief priests, and elders went away from Jesus defeated. Their attempts to bring him down had failed miserably. They failed to silence Jesus. And now the Sanhedrin, again, this religious body, this religious governing body allied against Jesus, will dispatch another group. Again, they're determined. So now, today, they send this group of Pharisees and Herodians, interestingly enough. A very unlikely partnership. We've already seen how the religious leaders feared the people. I mentioned that more than once. They feared the people rather than fearing God. And so they are bent on turning the people against Jesus. They hope to catch him, at the very least, in some unsavory, incriminating statement, or something that would be downright troublesome, that would lead the people away, that would discredit Jesus in the eyes of the people. And then here, today, the Herodians add something interesting to the mix. Together with the Pharisees, they employ a joint tactic which might force Jesus to speak against the government, to speak against Rome. So the idea being, if the Pharisees can't get the job done, the scribes and the elders and so on, they had not been able to, perhaps the Herodians can. The title of my message is in the form of a question. Must we render to Caesar? Our text is Mark 12, 13 through 17. Would you please turn there if you haven't done so already? Mark 12, verses 13 and through 17. Jesus overcame a sting attempt with wisdom and clarity. He said, respect government, but worship God. Would you look at the text with me? And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. And they came and said to him, Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinions, for you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, Why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. And they brought one. And he said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. Jesus said to them, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marveled at him. God directs us to respect government and devote ourselves in allegiance to him. Like the text, my message unfolds in two parts: a malicious question and a marvelous answer. Look now at number one, a malicious question. They sent another team. This is really an official, or at the very least semi-official delegation sent out by the Sanhedrin, as I've already mentioned. They're sent out on really an ingenious mission to entrap Jesus once for all. Again, like an epic sting operation. Perhaps they said to themselves, probably with good reason considering their track record, as they look at this, they think, this is finally going to work. The other things, for whatever reason, didn't work, but we've got him this time. There is no way he's getting out. They came to trap him. Verse 13 lays out very plainly. And when Mark says it this way, the fact of trapping him, he's actually using language which would normally be used for the hunting of animals, the trapping of animals. And that really gives us a picture of their malicious intent. They want to trap Jesus like an animal. My family in Missouri has a long tradition of trap hunting, trapping as they would call it. It's not primarily for sport. There are other forms of hunting that are more for sport, but this is usually done for side income. And the imagery of trapping an animal might be lost on many of us that live in an urban context, but it conjures up images for me just because of some of my exposure to this. The idea being that Jesus' opponents will not be fully satisfied until he is dead. They'd love for him to follow the path of his cousin, John the Baptist. The Pharisees and the Herodians, again, make up this very unlikely team. They didn't like each other. They had opposing visions, opposite visions. The Herodians were supporters of Herod, Herod's dynasty, so they were pro-Roman. They're a partisan political group. The Pharisees are not politically motivated, but they're no less partisan. On the opposite side, they were very anti-Roman. Their great hope, rather than Rome existing and sustaining, their great hope was that the Davidic Messiah would come and cast off the Gentile oppressors. Totally opposite. But they had a common rival in Jesus. So Jesus threatened the political stability in the eyes of the Herodians, so that gave them cause. Yeah, we don't like this guy. And the Pharisees recognized rightly that he completely undermined their power, the religious authorities in Jerusalem. And so they see him as a rival too. And so both of these groups basically join forces because they have a common enemy. They approach Jesus with words of flattery. I mean, just look at the way they speak. Look at verse 14. And they came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion. For you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God." Now, they hated saying these things. You'll have to recognize that. I mean, they just loathed saying these things. But they were willing to say them if it meant that they could finally get rid of Jesus. The fact is that we're willing to suffer really painful circumstances for a short time if we think that it lends to a much higher goal, to urgently desired consequences. I mean, just go back to sort of the sting analogy that I'm using. Officers will pose as prostitutes if necessary so that they can get the bad guy, right? Not something that any person thinks about doing on their Friday night just for fun. They'll go undercover for weeks or months as drug dealers at great risk to themselves if it means they're able to take down this drug ring. So we're willing to suffer through awkward, dangerous circumstances if it ultimately will lead to a very much coveted plan, desire, outcome. And honestly, as we look at their plan here, it is ingenious. It's the best that they've come up with so far. They hope to force him to speak honestly by puffing up his ego. Feeding that ego, they think. With all the things that they think that Jesus would want to hear, they'll force him to say something incriminating. They'll sort of lift him so high that he'll be forced to speak plainly. They hope that Jesus' pride, and boy, do they have this figured out wrong, but they hope that his pride would force him to say what's really on his mind. He'll have to be honest, and surely that'll be something incriminating. From another angle, too, perhaps they're saying to Jesus, hey, we know if anyone's going to give us the hard truth, it's going to be you. Just give us the hard truth. Do it, Jesus. Matthew, in his parallel passage, both Matthew and Luke also record this event. Matthew says that they wanted to entangle him in his words. Their flattery is nothing but a ploy. That's all it is. John MacArthur gives a helpful illustration on this very point. He speaks about a time when I believe they're administrators and professors from Brigham Young University, which is really the flagship university for Mormons. They had reached out to him And I think even sort of had come to his church there, and they're telling him, we appreciate your teaching so much, Dr. MacArthur. We love your style of preaching. In fact, we even use your textbooks in our university. Really, we have so much in common. We're basically, in the same religion. And basically what they were after, it was clear to him, they were after approbation. They wanted his approval. Whether it was so that they could tell others or whatever it was, they wanted this well-known preacher's approval. And if you know his style, he responded, I love the way he responded. He said, oh yeah, well, other than the fact that we have radically different views of God and of Christ and of the gospel, yeah, we have a few things in common. I think they eventually gave up and left. Flattery feels good, but flattery is a ploy. Like these men at BYU, people might try to use flattery to gain your approbation for something that you as a Christian should never be approving of. We need to be wise enough then. This is a call to wisdom. That we're able to sense when someone's flattery is trying to be used for their own advantage, to manipulate. And on the other side, we ourselves need to be careful that we don't try to use flattery to manipulate others. Flattery is one of those things where on the outside it can look good. We're giving people compliments. We're saying nice things. But yet when we're doing it so that they give us some service, so that we can get something from them, it becomes sinful and dangerous. We need to have wisdom, and we need to watch our own hearts. Although they were insincere, what they said about Jesus is actually true. Did you pick that up? R.T. France points out the fact that Mark would really expect his readers to recognize these words as a true assessment of Jesus' teaching. And we should too. Everything they say is true. As painful as it is for them to say it, it's ironic. They say, we know that you are guided by what is true. You're not guided by what is expedient. You're not swayed by human opinion. Amen. That's Jesus. Jesus held nothing back. He held none of the truth back when he spoke to anyone or everyone. He was not motivated by trying to please people. What about us? As we really think about that ourselves, are we characterized by truth, by clarity, always in love, but truth and clarity? Or are we more concerned with pleasing people? Are we more concerned with, we don't want to offend anybody, maybe I'll just hold back on some of that stuff. Maybe I'll talk about football rather than church. Church, hear this. It's simple, but it's something that we need to remember very carefully. You will not be able to please God if pleasing others is your first priority. Mark Strauss says this, and it's helpful. The statement by Jesus' interlocutors is doubly ironic. First, they praise Jesus for his integrity, while they themselves are being hypocritical and insincere. Second, with this false flattery, they end up making a profoundly true statement about his teaching and character. He is everything they say he is. So in the text we see that they asked. What are they asking? They say, should we pay taxes to Caesar? In other words, to the Roman government. Not speaking specifically about the emperor himself, but should we give our taxes to Rome? Effectively, is it right before God? Should we, as God's people, pay taxes to the Roman government? That's what they're asking him. Remember, they're asking a rabbi, not a government official. If they were to ask a local tax collector, he'd say, yeah, pay up. They're speaking to Jesus. They're asking religiously, morally, is it right that we do this? They're saying, according to our faith as God's people, should we give to Caesar? Should we pay taxes? And here is really the point, to these pagan oppressors. The text shows us that they hoped to compromise his status either with the people, the crowds, or with the Romans. And either would be fine in their book. And here's the dilemma. Again, and here, as I said, this is really the genius of what they're doing as they're coming against him. This is the ploy. If Jesus answered yes, the Pharisees could hope that the crowds would turn away from him. Certainly the more patriotic Jews would be expected to do so. Anyone with zealot sympathies, and we're already familiar with the zealots as really sort of a party, they would be absolutely inclined to leave. Oh, he wants us to pay to the Romans? All right, we're out of here. But if Jesus answered no, he might be guilty of sedition before Rome. And he might even be liable to arrest. I mean, either would do. So you see the dilemma. What is he going to answer? No matter how Jesus answers, he'll be in trouble, so they thought. The text tells us here that Jesus knew their malicious intent. Mark says that he knew their hypocrisy. Matthew says that he was aware of their malice, thus the malicious question. So there's the position poised to us. That's the question. That's the dilemma. But our Lord is never fazed by difficult questions. You know that? His answer displays his great wisdom. We've seen the malicious question, now the marvelous answer. Jesus said to them, "Why are you putting me to the test?" I mean, this reminds us that we're still in the context of authority, questions of authority. Who is the legitimate authority in Rome, in Palestine, in Judah, in Jerusalem? They've already challenged Jesus' authority, his own religious, spiritual authority, directly at really the end of chapter 11. We saw that 2 weeks ago, verses 27 through 33. And then just last week in chapter 12, leading up until our passage now, Jesus told a scathing parable to reveal their rebellious character and their illegitimate rule. So authority is again on the table, but now it's at this sort of governmental, political level. Who is the rightful authority? Rome or God? The Romans say they are, obviously, right? They're the bosses. They're the ones who are truly politically, socially domineering. The Jews say God is, and thus the conflict. This delegation is saying to Jesus, you've got to choose one. Is it Rome or is it God? There's no room for both, they would say. But Jesus will actually declare that both are legitimate. The text tells us that Jesus asked for a coin. He said, "Give me a coin." Strauss notes that this really heightens the drama of the event. So even before Jesus answers, he has sort of an object lesson. Give me a denarius. That's what he asked for specifically. He asked for a denarius. This is actually a pretty costly coin. It was worth about a day's wage for a laborer. But it bore the image of the emperor. Tiberius is the current emperor. His face would have been stamped on the side of this coin. Not only did it bear his image, but in Latin, circling around the side of the coin, it had an inscription that effectively said, Caesar is the Son of God. I mean, on its very face, the existence of this coin was blasphemous to the Jews. One more reason, we don't want to pay the emperor, we don't want to pay Rome because, well, they're domineering us, but we have to pay with this denarius. They had to pay with a certain coinage that would have been for this poll tax, this specific tax. All the background's really not all that important, but they would have to pay very likely with this coin. That's blasphemous. So again, heightening the drama of the moment. But what's strange? Notice they didn't mind carrying such a coin. Oh, I've got one. Right here. Not even realizing that, oh, maybe I shouldn't have this. They didn't mind carrying a coin with the graven image of a pagan king that described him literally as the Son of God. It said Augustus, God is divine, and his son, the emperor. Therein lies the hypocrisy. So when Jesus does this, though, he asks for this coin, holds it up perhaps. He acknowledges participation in Rome's economic system. And thus, in a sense, he acknowledges Rome's legitimate authority. Right off the bat. And so maybe even at that point they're going, I know where he's going with this. More radical Jews would not have liked this. And they're sort of sitting there, he's going to tell us that we need to bow to Rome. I wasn't expecting that, but I bet that's what he's going to do. The philosophy of the Zealots, again, they basically are a party that goes back to the earlier part of the first century, just a few years after Jesus was born. And they basically represent any opportunity to undermine and eventually, if they can, overthrow Rome. Any chance that they would get. And eventually they would try in 66 AD, and it would lead to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. That's what happened to the Zealots. You know, Jesus, just historically, you might not even be aware of this, but Jesus, whose childhood home in Nazareth was pummeled, virtually leveled by the Romans when he was just a young boy. This same Jesus does not share that vengeful zeal that the Zealots do. Such a zeal does not please God. The text shows us that Jesus validated the sphere of worldly government. Big principle. He validated the sphere of worldly government. What did he say? Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Now this is simple, but it's of great relevance to us, and we need to think really carefully about this because there's a lot on the line for this as we think about how do we live as faithful citizens in our own context. It's so plain from the text, it's so plain from the New Testament, but let's speak specifically here about Mark 12. Jesus was not a political revolutionary. He was not seeking to rise up against Rome. If he had any chance, this would have been it. And he doesn't do it. He rejects that ideology on its face. He says, yes, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. What kind of empire is he speaking about? Is this sort of a holy empire, a godly republic? This is Rome. Even a pagan empire like Rome was due obedience from God's people. Christians, we are not called only to obey governments that seem to uphold justice and equality as we would want, as believers, rightly as we would want. We are not called only to obey some hypothetical government, if it has ever existed anyway. Jesus taught that we owe a debt of respect even to an idolatrous, bloodthirsty empire like Rome. Even to such a government, we're called to faithfully and honestly, here in the context, pay taxes. We're called to obey the laws of the land, to show respect for those in power. God commands it. As we know elsewhere in the New Testament, Romans 13, 1 through 7, 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17. In fact, I preached on that several months ago. Well, it was probably more than a year ago now. God calls us to, according to those texts, adding even background to this, to respect governing authorities that He has placed over us. Both of those passages affirm that. When we respect the government, we respect God. And this is especially relevant in our context when we are really surrounded, especially within the last couple of years, we're just surrounded by anti-government sentiment. How do we as Christians think about that? How do we respond to that? Should we join it? Should we speak against it? What do we do as Christians? That's our context. Regardless of our own liking of a government, and really just, as we think about our own case, regardless of who might be holding a particular office or whether or not we're satisfied with congressional law or state laws, we have to affirm that God is sovereign over human governments. We must. Regardless of who is in Sacramento or in Washington, regardless of who is in power, God is sovereign over human governments. Daniel 2, and really several places in Daniel, but think about Daniel 2:21. It says, He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. Our God is sovereign over the governments of this world. Jesus validated the sphere of government. That was the first point here. But now, of even greater importance, the other side of this. Jesus sustained God's universal rule. What does he say? He says, give to God those things that are God's. And as we think about that, okay, so what belongs to Caesar? Okay, we've got some of that. So what is it that belongs to God? What are those things that we're supposed to give to God? Jesus validated the authority of government, of earthly government. But we owe God the far greater allegiance, the ultimate allegiance. God directs us to respect government and devote allegiance to him. Now, I'm choosing that word "and" intentionally here. I could say but also to him. But I'm choosing the word "and" to communicate the point that these two are not diametrically opposed. However, sometimes these two do conflict, where the rule of the world, the rule of human government, ultimately conflicting with the commands of God. So then what do we do in that circumstance? Okay, God's told us to respect the government. What does that mean? Does anything in the scriptures qualify that? Yes. We obey God rather than man. Acts 5:29, example of the apostles. If ever the two conflict, we owe God our first, foremost, and always devotion and loyalty. We respect the worldly government over us, recognizing that it is from God, but we worship God alone. Jesus said to give Caesar those things that are his, right? But worship is never one of those things. We worship God alone. And so as much as I must declare that we are called to respect and to submit to earthly governing authorities, that does not imply some form of nationalism, which amounts to worship of one's country. That also is sin. Whether it's national or city or the pride of one's state or a political party, we do not worship these. We worship God alone. Our worship belongs only to him, and that implies our ultimate loyalty. Whatever we worship, whatever we give our heart to, therein lies our loyalty, and it must belong only to God. What do we do if the two conflict? Well, John Piper has a helpful statement here. He says, any claim Caesar makes on you, you test by the infinitely higher claim God has on you. The church has been faithful to demonstrate that, both in good times and in bad. In a general sense, this has been true historically. Peter tells us to submit to earthly authorities. He says, for the Lord's sake. That's in 1 Peter 2:13. That's important. Because even as John Piper also points out here, this limits, Peter says that it limits what is Caesar's and how we should render it to him. In other words, render to Caesar nothing that you cannot render for the Lord's sake. But what might this look like? Okay, we get it, preacher. Okay, here's some good principles. What does this actually look like? We have examples in the Bible. There are many. I'll look at just a few of when God's people disobeyed their governing authorities because of their higher allegiance to God. Think of the Hebrew midwives who feared God and refused to heed Egypt's command to kill all of the male children born to the Hebrews, Exodus 1:17. They feared God more than men. You know well the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to bow before the pagan statue in Babylon, Daniel 3. Also in the book of Daniel, in chapter 6, 10 through 13, Daniel defied King Darius' decree that would have limited him from praying to Yahweh. He didn't have to think hard about that. He went on praying. And he even did it publicly, where people could see him. And as I've already noted earlier, Acts 5:29, the apostles refused to stop preaching the gospel, even under threat. They feared God. They obeyed God rather than man. So church, Jesus demonstrated that there is not necessarily a clash between the legitimate claims of the earthly government and those for God. God directs us to respect government and devote allegiance to him. But this answer was not one that any zealot could have given. But neither is it simply pro-Roman. So how is Jesus getting out of this? Zealots wouldn't have liked this, but it's not pro-Roman either. Loyalty to God and respect for the earthly authorities can be maintained at the same time. Notice Jesus doesn't consider who is holding office here. He doesn't speak about Tiberius by name. He doesn't speak about specific local leaders. He spoke in a very generic way, in a very general way, and that's significant to us because Rome's not over us. We can speak about that in a certain way. Peter spoke very similarly later, and we know that Nero was very likely the emperor when Peter wrote his letter. So hear this, church. Our respect of government is not determined by whether we prefer the guy or gal who's in office. Do you hear that? Whether we like the track record of a particular government or a particular party or not, whoever's in power, ultimately does not bear on us. Now, I've noted that exceptions do occur. But the important starting point here is that we understand that the normal situation is that the two coexist. And that is a good thing, church. Jesus' answer made them marvel. I mean, he just answered with stunning wisdom. And notice he doesn't merely evade the question either. There are times where he just says, I'm not even going to answer that. But he doesn't evade the question here. He answered it. And as Mark Strauss says, by distinguishing legitimate spheres of authority in life, Jesus resolves the dilemma and silences his critics. This scene is reminiscent of Solomon of old. Actually, Jesus' ancestor according to the flesh. A man of great wisdom who when he spoke, when he solved dilemmas, it says that the people heard and they marveled. Isaiah foretold of Christ, and I want to read about it briefly. Turn with me to Isaiah 11. Isaiah chapter 11. Just 3 verses we'll read clearly in Mark's mind as he writes this. Isaiah 11 verse 1 says this, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him. The Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear. Clearly in the background of Mark's mind as he writes this. Church, recognize this. No one will ever outsmart Jesus. No one will ever catch him in a lie or in some unjust act. No one will ever catch him doing or saying something that he'll later regret. It won't happen. He's holy. He's without sin. And Christ's great wisdom and holiness confirm that he is the Messiah. And that's one of the reasons I'm connecting this with Isaiah chapter 11. He is indeed the Messiah. Who else could answer with such wisdom? Who else could be so holy? So really, if I gave a really wooden translation for this last verse, they were marveling at him. There's a durative sense. They're sort of standing there marveling at him. Al Mohler is the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, where I have had the privilege to study. He's regarded widely as a leading evangelical voice in the United States. I don't know anyone who would dispute that. I remember one of the first times that I had the opportunity to hear him speak in person. He was giving a lecture about the history of preaching, where we have been, where we are now, and why preaching will never lose its relevance. And I just sat there mesmerized. I mean, I don't think I shifted in my seat for the whole hour or 70 minutes that he spoke. I was mesmerized. What I heard was profound. I knew I was in the presence of someone great. in a similar yet in a far superior way. Those present at this moment that our text records marveled at Jesus. I mean, they just stood there staring, unable to say anything. They knew that they were in the presence of a great man, but that's only half of the story. The Pharisees and the Herodians had hoped to trap him, but they would never be able to do so. They could never outsmart him. They're never going to be able to corner him. They would never be able to overcome him. The only way that they'll have any chance of ever taking Jesus down is if he laid down his life willingly. And he did surrender. He'll soon do so, even this very week. He will go to the cross quietly, like a lamb before the slaughter. When he could have called down angels to rescue him, when he could have escaped at any moment, he laid down his life. This was God's design to save his people from their sins. And the only way that it could have come about was through the will of God and Jesus submitting to the Father. This was a failed sting operation. Didn't go how they had hoped. They approached Jesus with this ingenious way, but the Lord was not fazed by it. He answered with wisdom and clarity. And again, by Mark Strauss, by distinguishing legitimate spheres of authority in life, Jesus resolves the dilemma and silences his critics. So hear this word, church. Yes, to answer the question, we can live with a government that isn't favorable to us. You realize that? Have you asked yourself that question in the last year, 2, 5, 10, maybe the last generation, when things have changed around us, even here in California? We can live with a government that isn't favorable to us or doesn't uphold things that we would want to see a government uphold in justice. We can live with leaders who represent ungodly things. Welcome to earth. That doesn't mean that we should like either of these. But what it does mean is this. When governments oppose us, when governments represent things that are unjust, when governments are hostile, when we truly do realize that we are pilgrims and strangers in this world, we endure with patience. We endure sometimes even through suffering. And even that, the Lord walks with us. So may that comfort you. May that reassure you. May that guide you, come what may. Don't tell me that the Bible has no relevance for real life. It just sort of talks with spiritual or moral things. That's nonsense. This whole thing is about politics. So much that we can learn from this as we seek to navigate wisely, faithfully through the world. The title of this message has been, Must We Render to Caesar? Well, the answer, yes. We must. God directs us to respect and submit to the governing authorities of the earth. But as we do so, we remember that we worship God alone, and our loyalty to Him is ultimate and undivided.